So now that we've got things installed, I think it's very important to, before we dive into any coding, actually understand what our project structure is doing for us and how Angular is bootstrapping our application, which is essentially kicking it off, compiling our code, and then it's being served on our local server. So first things first, if we jump into our source directory, and this isn't going to take us too long, but it's important to understand the flow from our component to a module to our main file. So there are a few things that I want to investigate in this lesson. First things first, we have this app module. A module is a building block, as we've seen, where we can create feature-specific code. Now, in an Angular application, it's very common to just have a root module, such as our app, and then we import loads of other modules, such as feature modules. These could be things such as an admin module, a dashboard module, you name it. It's up to you what features you're going to be building for you to then import them. And it's typical that we then go and import them into this root, this app module. So this is where all the magic happens. Now, from the top, we have this thing called a browser module. Now, Angular can be used on not only the web. So this is telling the Angular compiler that we want to use the web platform. We want to then talk to that browser module. Now, for this, we need to then import it into our application module. Now, this might look quite strange to you if you've not actually seen TypeScript or perhaps TypeScript decorators before. Now, if you are new to JavaScript or perhaps you're coming from another language, you probably have seen something like this before, where we have this class keyword. Now, export is essentially allowing us to reference this app module in another file, which I will show you momentarily. But essentially, this is called a TypeScript decorator. A decorator simply adds metadata, or if you like, in simpler terms, some further information to a particular class or a property such as this. So what this is doing is saying, here is my app module, and Angular is then going to bind this piece of further information to this class. Because if we go and delete this ng module, it's just a plain JavaScript class. Even though it's written in TypeScript, it is TypeScript. It then becomes a standard JavaScript class. If we then add an ng module decorator, it's adding and sprinkling a bit of Angular's superpowers on top. So from here, we're then saying we want to import our browser module. And this is then necessary for us to kick off our application with our app module. Now, there's also two things happening here. We have our app component, which is being declared. So any components that we want to use in our module, we'll likely add them to this declarations array. And this root module is unique in the fact that we are telling Angular which application we want to bootstrap. And the way that we know this, if we click through to our app component, you can see that we're creating another class called app component, which then uses a component decorator. And we'll come onto this more as we continue through our components, and this will make far more sense. So don't let it worry you too much now. But essentially we have this selector, and this tells Angular what the element's name is going to be, because Angular is all about creating your own custom components and giving them a unique name. So here we have app-root, which if we jump inside of our index, we have app-root. So that component is being directly tied and created in our index.html. You will notice that there are no script tags in here, so the Angular CLI is going to be taking care of all of that for us. If we inspect our element here, we can jump into the body and we have this runtime.js, polyfill, styles, vendor, and main. So there are lots of things here that Webpack is building in for us that don't actually exist in our raw index.html source file. So that's an important consideration for us. So now we've covered the concept of this module and this chunk of code that we want to bootstrap. Our app module typically just takes an app component, which we've looked at the definition. Our app component has a template. You can go ahead and start changing a few of these things should you wish. Similarly, we also have some inline styles. So once we export this class of app component, we've added this other decorator. We can then import it into our module. We then export the module. And this is where the magic happens inside this main.ts file. So we don't really need to touch this. This gets done for us by Angular. This CLI is generating this project structure as well as all these extra files for us. So Angular imports this production mode and calls it if it needs to. We don't need to worry about this. It toggles all these environment variables for us. If we're compiling for production, this is then true, and Angular's prod mode is then enabled. Without prod mode enabled, we get more helpful debugging errors, so this is really useful for us to use in our development. But essentially, we have our app module, and then we simply call this platform browser dynamic, which then has this bootstrap module function. We then simply pass the module in. If there's any errors, we then can read it out on the console. Now you may be thinking these are some quite strange words, platform, browser, dynamic, but essentially we don't really need to worry about these apart from understanding how they work and how they flow together. So we have the component, we pass the component to the module, and then we say, I want to bootstrap this application module. It's likely that we don't need to change this, so we don't really need to worry about this main.ts file. However, I'd like to give you an overview of what's happening. We also have some polyfills for any browsers that you might want to enable, some extra features for if you are in fact supporting some older browsers. We also have our test file, which again, we don't need to touch, but is used for our testing suite. So with this in mind, we've had a look through our entire folder structure. We've looked at the Angular application, the bootstrapping process from component passed to the module, and then that main.ts, which is then bootstrapping our entire Angular application. Inside of here, we also have that environments with our local host, so this is production false, and our build, which is then production of true. You can add some other flags in here if you'd like. We also have the assets, which I've pre-populated with some icons and some images. So again, we don't need to touch these. So that's pretty much it for our Angular walkthrough. It's quite a simple bootstrapping process, despite some of the slightly elongated wording, such as platform, browser, dynamic. But again, we don't need to worry too much about this. So with that in mind, let's dive into the next chapter, where we're going to then start looking at Angular's templating syntax and how we can start to bind data and look at some of the features of the framework.